Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. Fire crews in Lethbridge were called to a house fire on the city's west side on Tuesday. We have the details as to what caused the devastating blaze. Pope Francis wrapped up his trip in Alberta with a special mass held at Edmonton's Commonwealth Stadium. We have reactions. And as the war in Ukraine continues, a special Christian group is working hard reaching special needs children.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Pope Francis spoke in 3 First Nations languages on Tuesday during a sacred pilgrimage at a lake northwest of Edmonton. The pontiff joined hundreds of people at Lac St. Anne during a church service and said hello in Blackfoot, Cree, and Nakota. Earlier in the week, the Pope apologized to residential school survivors and their families for the role members of the Catholic Church played in the forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples. Now, during his Central Alberta tour, Pope Francis also spoke about the importance of grandparents and the elderly as thousands gathered for a public mass at Edmonton's football stadium. Francis blessed and kissed young babies and children that were handed to him as he was driven through Commonwealth Stadium ahead of the service. Indigenous people at the Pope's Mass talk about his apology and messaging during the religious ceremony which took place in Edmonton.
I want to be part of this historical moment because I'm a day schooler and I'm also a daughter of a residential survivor. And I have other siblings that went to day school. Some of them have passed. But I'm here basically on my own. I'm on my own healing journey from all this. So it's bringing some closure and more understanding of how my parents were treated. And unfortunately, their treatment was the same as how I was treated.
I'm curious to see where the Pope, provincial leaders are going to go from here and if they're going to get the Queen involved. That's the only way that they're going to get anything done is going through the monarchy next, is to take those proper steps to get all the rest of the history out there.
I had 8 siblings going to the Lord Post residential school. We've all survived, but a lot of us have struggle in our lives. Some of us are healing, others can't get past it, and we're elders now.
Pope Francis left Edmonton for Quebec City late Wednesday to begin the next stage of what he called his penitential journey in Canada. Now, was the apology from Pope Francis enough? Dr. Crystal Gale-Fraser is a professor of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, and she says more steps need to be taken towards reconciliation and healing.
In order to really advance the pursuit of truth, which, for the record, we still don't know all there is to know about the history of residential schools, about the circumstances in which these children died and then were buried in unmarked graves. So there's a truth bit, but also the reconciliation. And reconciliation really needs action. And so we had very high hopes for this apology, but then also the expectation of accountability and an action plan that would be shared by the Catholic Church.
Make sure you catch the full interview with Professor Fraser and BCN's Jeanette Rocher coming up in the second half of our program. Hockey Canada President and CEO Scott Smith says he believes he's capable of fighting the toxic culture in the sport. He told MPs that he's prepared to step aside, however, if the Board of Governors or the results of a governance review determine otherwise.
I've definitely heard from Canadians, whether that be parents or, people in general across the country. I've said to the members of the committee that, I'm sure someone's going to ask, what are my thoughts on resignation, so I'll save you having to ask that question. I believe that I'm the right person to get Hockey Canada to a better place, and based on my experience, I'm committed to do that. I'm driven, I'm passionate, I'm a hockey dad, and I'm not proud of some of the incidents that have taken place. I'm not. But I believe in my abilities. I'm driven to get Hockey Canada to a better place. I'm open to, if the board chooses otherwise, then I'm open to facing those consequences.
Hockey Canada says it paid out $7.6 million in 9 settlements related to sexual assault and sexual abuse claims dating back to 1989. The majority claims related to serial abuser Graham James. Its multi-million-dollar national equity fund was also used to pay for the services of a law firm that has been investigating an alleged sexual assault dating back in 2018. UCP leadership candidate Danielle Smith landed in a little bit of hot water recently. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson explained that it had to do with a comment she made about those dealing with cancer. She allegedly made claims you can control cancer before a stage 4 diagnosis.
She sort of implied that up to that point, cancer was sort of up to the choices that an individual might make. And there was a really, really quick and immediate backlash from that. The New Democrats got in on it, and then she said, well, the New Democrats just don't want to talk about cancer prevention. But then her fellow leadership candidates attacked her as well. You know, Brian Jean saying that as someone who's lost family and friends to cancer, that was a hurtful thing to say. Travis Taves, and pretty much everyone, Leela here, the whole sort of group of them really came down quite hard on her for this comment she'd made in the podcast.
Mr. Tyler Dawson will also discuss which candidate is currently leading in the polls to succeed Jason Kenney as Premier and UCP leader this October. Well, the province says it will be offering financial help to Albertans in supportive living and long-term care. In a release, officials say the Alberta government will give $11 million to seniors to help with accommodation in the battle against inflation. The aid will run from November 1st to June 30th of next year. This funding is in addition to the $14 million already allocated to help residents from July 1st to October 31st. Health Minister Jason Copping says it's important to help subsidize a portion of the accommodation costs in publicly funded continuing care homes. Well, it was another hot and sunny day here in Lethbridge, a nice day to maybe even work on your tan. Jeanette Rocher is in now with a quick peek of the weather forecast. Jeanette, it may be a good time to continue lathering on the sunscreen as we get closer to the Heritage Day long weekend.
Yeah, probably a good idea to work on your tan there because it is going to be hot, hot, hot this week. Looking into a high of 32 degrees on Thursday with a humidex of 35. Now, those temperatures sticking around, we could see up into the mid-30s by early next week. In fact, most of Alberta under a heat wave, and particularly in southern Alberta, it could last into next week as well. I'll have more details coming up for you about that later on in the show.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeanette. Lethbridge fire crews responded to a house fire in the West Lethbridge neighborhood of Riverstone. Crews from 3 fire stations arrived to find a home with flames shooting out of the first, second floors, along with the attic. Fortunately, crews were able to quickly extinguish the blazes. Lead fire investigator Adam Satterley says the cause of the fire started because smoking materials were not disposed of properly.
It was a cigarette that was put out in a combustible container, a plastic container. From the time that the resident remembers being out there and then noticing that there was a problem was only about 20 minutes. So that gives you an idea of you know how quickly something like that can get away. And when you've got other combustible materials that are on the deck or say in a backyard area, those can catch fire, you know, very quick, and it just kind of snowballs from there.
Fortunately, there were no injuries, including a cat that was rescued by fire crews. Damage to the home was estimated at around $750,000. An investigation into the origin of the fire continues. Now, here's a follow-up to a story we first brought you yesterday. The issue of tent encampments in our city has continued to be a hot-button topic of discussion. Lethbridge City Council voted 7-1 in favor of approving funding for $230,000 to assist in administrative and policing shortfalls to hurry forward with compassionate cleanups of tent sites here in our city. The money will come from the city's corporate budget contingencies.
It may seem to many that we're not being compassionate, but over the past few weeks, I want to just talk to a few different emails that I'd received, starting with 4 tents here a couple of days ago to 12 tents this morning to over 45 now in one particular area. A shooting in the area. That's not safe for anyone, as these areas aren't safe for whether you're homeless or if you have a home or those that are visiting our community. It's just not a safe area. It's been proven. We've seen this happen.
Council also voted for a later date to present an additional $470,000 to help assist with additional cleanup that goes beyond traditional tent encampments. One Lethbridge woman says she's outraged at the city's handling of the tent encampment situation. Sarah Villaburn, who attended Tuesday's council meeting, says it's frustrating to see the city just shuffle the problem as there's another cleanup effort going to be taking place on Thursday. She says the best solution would be to find appropriate housing options for the homeless.
We know the solution. So the question is, why are we not doing it? When we're throwing money at security, we're asking for more funds to go to LPS. Yes, LPS needs more funds, but do we need more funds for an encampment cleanup specifically? No, we need to allocate that money where it needs to go, and that is on housing. They know the solution, and that's where the anger is. We can't just keep shuffling somebody under a bridge from the shelter to the civic oval. You know, we're shuffling the problem when we know what the solution is.
Philibert adds that some of her family is currently living in the encampments, which makes the situation even more heartbreaking for her. An amendment to legislation for free bus passes for refugees was debated at Lethbridge City Council on Tuesday. Council asked city administration to allow refugees from Ukraine to have free bus passes for those coming into our city. The initiative would last for 6 months. Lethbridge Deputy Mayor Jen Schmidt-Rempel says this was an easy decision for the members of council to reverse, and it was passed unanimously by an 8-0 vote.
What this is doing is making sure that they are included there, offering some clarification that they are coming under a different program, and enabling them that opportunity to get bus passes, to get to those doctor's appointments. I know that's one of the necessary things they have to do as soon as they get here, and other necessary appointments right off the bat, helping them sort of get their leg up as they work through a very difficult time in their lives.
Total funds for the initiative would equal around $90,000. Well, a special puppy has been named by the Lethbridge Police Service. The Belgian Malinois was given the name of Bridge. 13-year-old Cassie Houghton was the winner of the naming contest and was presented with a stuffed Malinois along with a tour of the police station. The dog naming contest saw 700 entries in total. Constable Braylon Hagan with the K-9 unit says this new four-legged officer and friend will do great work in the city to help sniff out crime.
A lot of times we will have people that run from us or hide, and without a dog in the sense of their smell, we would not be able to find them. So we have found people hiding in garbage cans that normally we probably wouldn't even look in when somebody runs from a break and enter. We've tracked people anywhere from 5 kilometers through the river valley to locating people inside businesses. So will be part of his job, everything from locating evidence to searching buildings and compounds. We've had people found in our own police compound before that have broken in there and hidden in cars, and our dogs have been able to go in and find them a lot quicker than what we would do, have them go car to car to search under everything that's in vehicles. So.
What a cute little dog. By the way, Bridge is only 4 months old and will be ready to hit the streets by the year 2024. A beautiful new exhibit has made its way to the Birds of Prey Centre in Coaldale. A local photographer has captured the birds in all of their glory. As BCN's Micah Quinn explains, there are 29 different pictures of the winged animals featured in this very special exhibit.
I've owned a camera for over 60-some years, since I was 12.
Coaldale photographer Clive Schottmeyer lives across the street from the Birds of Prey Centre and created the exhibit called Looking Out My Back Door, which is on display at the Natural History Centre. The photographs are made up of various bird species from around the Coaldale and southern Alberta area.
There's a wide range of birds here. There's upland birds and what are called passerine birds. Those are perching birds. There's a grosbeak and a robin and a cedar waxwing. And then there's a lot of waterfowl here, some ducks and a couple of goose photographs and pelicans and a loon. But then there's a lot of birds of prey. There's a ferruginous hawk here and several owl photos.
Picking a favorite picture was hard for Schottmeyer, but one that's dear to his heart comes from 2008.
It's an eared grebe, and it's got a stickleback in its mouth. It played around with a stickleback before it could actually get it down its mouth.
The managing director for the Birds of Prey Centre, Colin Weir, handpicked Schottmeyer to display his photographs in the exhibit.
And he's out here almost every week of the year, just taking literally tens of thousands of photographs here over the last 20 years. And he's a brilliant photographer, as you can see from all the pictures behind me.
The exhibit will be on display at the Birds of Prey Centre for the remainder of the summer until September 5th. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
A 21-year-old Edmonton man has been arrested and charged with child luring and sexual assault of at least 6 victims. Alert's Internet Child Exploitation Unit alleges that Imesh Radnaike was involved in a number of child luring instances which took place in both Edmonton and Morinville. Police say the 21-year-old met the youth online and lured them into performing sexual acts. Officials say he targeted young girls he met on Snapchat. One of the victims was just 11 years of age. Radnaike faces a long list of charges, including sexual assault, sexual interference, luring a child, and making child pornography. He was released from custody and will appear in court on August the 4th. New data from Stats Canada says Manitoba had the second highest consumer inflation in the country in June. Premier Heather Stephenson says her government is considering what it can do to help. Stephenson would not talk specifics, but says an announcement on affordability is on the way. Josh Brandon of the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg says he would like to see increases in social assistance, rent freezes, and temporary benefits for low and moderate income families. When Konotop in the Sumy region of Ukraine came under attack from Russian troops, the team, which runs a Christian Special Needs Children's Center, was determined to keep the ministry going. Peter Wooding has more now in this report.
A Christian-run special needs children's centre in Konotop in northeast Ukraine and close to the Russian border has remained open despite the war. Each day their team supports young people with a range of conditions through classes and activities while sharing God's love with them. But every time they hear air raid sirens, they have to stop and take shelter in the corridors and pray together. The Hearts of Love director is Leni Yashchenko.
Konotop was surrounded with Russian troops for more than a month, and all responsibility was on my shoulders. And we realized that every day, every minute, the situation might get worse. And the fact that we opened the center, all responsibility was on me, and that was scary.
Masha, who has Williams syndrome, has been going there for the past 10 years, since she was 3 years old.
Нормально, в душе було клас.
Yeah, I felt like so peaceful and joyful in my heart when I came here.
Hearts of Love receives ongoing support from Christian charity Mercy Projects, who regularly take vital supplies that help them continue their work. Lena says it helps them to know that they're not forgotten.
It gave us strength to go on and to work and not to close our center, because we felt that kind of people know about us. This support is our treasure. We don't know what can be next minute or next second because Konotop is very close to the border. So we're really thankful for your support and your prayers.
And as Lena and her staff dreams of a day when peace will return to their country, they continue to share the peace of Christ with all those who come to them for help. Peter Wooding for the Global News Alliance.
Wonderful to see the great work they're doing in Ukraine with special needs children. Well, it was another beautiful day across much of southwestern Alberta, and those sizzling hot temperatures will continue. A look at the long-range forecast, along with a detailed look at national temperatures, are coming up. We enjoyed lots of sunshine and warm temperatures across many parts of southwestern Alberta again today. Jeanette Rocher is in now with a complete look at the forecast. Jeanette, if you're into stargazing the next couple of nights, it should be perfect weather for it.
Yeah, it sure should, Hal. Only a few clouds this evening, and then overnight lows staying relatively mild, just sticking around those teen temperatures around 13 degrees as the low tonight. So it should be a really nice night to be outside if you're like me and you like to linger on your deck well into the evening. Should be a perfect night for it. Into Thursday, we're looking at a high of 32 degrees. Should feel like 35 with that humidex. Lots of sunshine as well. 31 on a Friday. Sunshine sticking around for the weekend. 29 the high on Saturday, Sunday's high 31, all the way up to 35 on Monday. That's August 1st. Could be a record breaker. So the record for that day was 35.8. So we'll see if we get a little higher than that. And then 32 on Tuesday. So we are well up there. We're sitting in a heat wave. Much of Alberta is actually, particularly southern Alberta, staying into next week. Average high for this time of year, 26, average low 11. 37 was our high temperature on this day back in 1939. And in 1997, we had our chilliest, which was 5 degrees. 5:55 is when the sun rose this morning and the sun set this evening, 9:21 p.m., giving us a little less daylight than we had yesterday, about 2 minutes less. So we're sitting at about 15 hours and 26 minutes of daylight now. Okay, so let's take a look at the high temperatures across the nation, starting on the west coast. Also, British Columbia sitting in a heat warning. Those heat warnings remaining in effect well into the weekend. 31 the high in Victoria, lots of sunshine. 27 the high in Vancouver. Keep in mind, inland going to feel more like up into the 40s with that humidex, so it's very hot conditions. 35 in Edmonton tomorrow. 29 the high in Calgary tomorrow, so remaining hot right across Alberta. The rest of the prairies also fairly warm here. 26 the high in Saskatoon tomorrow, sunny skies, sunshine, and 24 in Regina. Winnipeg sitting at 23. Now they could see a chance of some showers tomorrow and winds kicking up to 30 to 50 kilometers per hour. Now in central Canada, Toronto sitting at 27 tomorrow, could see a 60% chance of showers, risk of thunderstorms. Same thing for Ottawa with a high of 29, and same thing for Montreal with that risk of thunderstorm tomorrow, 27 the high, and of course the humidex remaining fairly high in those three central cities as well. Now as we look to the east coast here, 29 the high in Fredericton, same thing for Halifax, sitting under sunny skies all over the Maritimes here. 28 the high in Charlottetown tomorrow, and a high of 22 in St. John's, Newfoundland, with lovely clear skies as well. So there you go, that is your weather forecast.
Rogers announced it has extended the deadline for its proposed $26 billion merger with Shaw Communications to the end of the year. Rogers reported a 35% increase in its second quarter profit. Company officials said the decision to move the date from July 31st reflects a commitment by both companies to getting a deal done. The comments came after the cable, wireless, and media company says it earned $409 million in its second quarter. Rogers also said the customer credits related to its July 8th network outage are estimated to cost around $150 million and will be included in its third quarter results. Canadian National Railway is reporting record second quarter revenues and a 28% rise in profits year over year. Company officials say it's mainly due to a spike in crude oil and container sales. The Montreal-based company says total revenues rose 21% to $4.34 billion in the quarter ending June 30th compared with the same period last year. Net income was also up $289 million to $1.3 billion last quarter. On an adjusted basis, diluted earnings shot up by 30% to $1.93 per share year over year. Loblaw Company says its second quarter adjusted profits increased from $464 to $566 million. Canada's largest grocery and pharmacy chain says revenues were up 2.9% to $12.85 billion. Loblaw says drugstore sales boosted its margins and discount grocery store sales grew as inflation is at a 40-year high. Food same-store sales increased 0.9% and pharmacy same-store sales increased 5.6%. A report from Stats Canada says Manitoba is home to the highest proportion of farmers aged 35 and under in the country. It says in its 2021 agricultural census that Manitoba has more than 11% of its agricultural operators identifying in that age group. That is higher than the overall Canadian percentage of just over 8%. The proportion of female operators in the province also saw an increase of nearly 3% to more than 5,100. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 281 points in the day to finish at 19,254. The Dow was up 436 points to 32,197. The S&P 500 was up 102 points on the day to 4,023. And the Nasdaq was up 469 to 12,032. West Texas Intermediate Oil was up 314 to 98.12 U.S. per barrel. Natural gas was down 31 cents to 8.69 U.S. Gold was down 5 cents to 17.3413 U.S. an ounce, and silver was up a cent to 19.09 U.S. an ounce. Feed wheat is at $11.43 per bushel. Barley's at $8.31. Canola's at $18.67, and corn is at $10.64 per bushel. Live cattle August contract was down 8 cents to $136.80. Feeder cattle August contract was up $1.68 to $179.10, and lean hogs August contract was up $1.63 to $118.60. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to 77.98 U.S. Recapping one of our top stories, the province says it will be offering financial help to Albertans in supportive living and long-term care. Now, in a release, officials say the Alberta government will give $11 million to seniors to help with accommodation in the battle against inflation. The aid will run from November 1st to June 30th of next year. This funding is in addition to the $14 million already allocated to help residents from July 1st to October 31st. A new poll by Leger is out, which discusses who the frontrunners are when it comes to the UCP leadership race. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson will have details in just a moment. And a reminder, if you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. We'd love to hear from you.
Here's today's Bridge City News community calendar. The Lethbridge Senior Citizens Organization is looking for volunteers to take part in their Drive Happiness program. This program is to help seniors in our community who are facing extreme loneliness due to a lack of accessible transportation. Volunteers will drive clients to their medical appointments, pick up groceries, and take them to important life activities. If you're interested in this opportunity and for more information, call 403-332-4320 or email volunteer@volunteerlethbridge.com. Lethbridge Legal Guidance is a nonprofit society offering free legal advice to low-income Southern Albertans. It holds clinics on Tuesdays from 4 to 6 p.m. by appointment only. Some of the areas the society assists in include family, criminal, traffic, immigration, EI, and other issues. For more information, call 403-380-6338 or visit their website, lethbridgelegalguidance.ca.
The UCP will be choosing their new leader on October the 6th. Now, the race to succeed Jason Kenney as Premier continues to heat up. One of the frontrunners, Danielle Smith, found herself in a little bit of hot water recently. To talk about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us from Edmonton. Tyler, what did Danielle Smith say exactly that received a little bit of backlash?
Well, she was on a podcast talking to a naturopath, and they were talking about cancer. And basically what she said was that when stage 4 cancer comes along, you have treatments, you have radiation, you have chemotherapy, those sorts of things. But she sort of implied that up to that point, cancer was sort of up to the choices that an individual might make. And there was a really, really quick and immediate backlash from that. The New Democrats got in on it, and then she said, well, the New Democrats just don't want to talk about cancer prevention. But then her fellow leadership candidates attacked her as well. You know, Brian Jean saying that as someone who's lost family and friends to cancer, that was a hurtful thing to say. Travis Taves, and pretty much everyone, Leela here, the whole sort of group of them really came down quite hard on her for this comment she'd made in the podcast. Whether or not that will matter remains to be seen, but it is the first, I would say, major slip up that she's had in this campaign.
Has she backpedaled at all on that comment?
No, it doesn't seem like it. Rather, she seems to have sort of doubled down by talking about cancer prevention. It would not shock me, though, if she had to backtrack in the next little while, though.
Now, speaking of Danielle Smith, her Alberta Sovereignty Act is picking up some steam as well. Explain, Tyler, exactly how it works and why House Leader Jason Nixon says it's illegal and unenforceable.
The idea is basically that if this act was passed, the Alberta government could decide to ignore federal government laws, regulatory decisions, and court rulings that they believe would affect Alberta in a negative way. So let's say there was a highway project and that was going through the impact assessment process. That's the process that was created by Bill C-69, if people cast their minds back. Her argument is that we would be able to go, no, we're not going to listen to the regulatory process the federal government sets out. Rather, we are going to be able to give out our own permits and business will continue. There are some obvious problems that people have pointed out with that. But Jason Nixon and Travis Taves in particular have come down quite hard on it. And Nixon is notable because, of course, he's not in the leadership race. And he said basically that, this probably wouldn't even pass even if the United Conservatives held the entire House, and that at any rate, it would be illegal and it would be unenforceable because, who's going to listen to the Alberta government when the federal government holds enforcement powers to levy fines and things like that. So the proposal's got a lot of attention in the last few weeks and has got quite a bit of criticism too from within the party.
Now, still with the leadership race, Tyler, we've crossed the threshold to the official candidates in the race to replace Premier Jason Kenney. And the 7 of them are Daniel Smith, who we just talked about, Brian Jean, Travis Taves, Leela Ahir, Rebecca Schultz, Todd Lowen, and Rajan Sani. Now, this means that 3 others failed to make the cut?
That's right. So the 3 others is Bill Rock, I believe, who's a Southern Alberta mayor, John Horsman, who's a businessman, and Raj Sherman, the former Liberal leader who had sort of intended to run in the race and obviously did not get very far with it. So they just sort of didn't meet the financial and paperwork sort of threshold. But the reason this is important, of course, is because now we know what that slate of candidates is going to look like unless someone else drops out over the next, what will that be, 6 weeks or so here.
Now, some new polling numbers are out from Leger as to who the frontrunners are, and so far to succeed Premier Jason Kenney as UCP leader. Who's at the very top?
It is actually Daniel Smith at 22% support, and it's pretty neck and neck though, because you have Brian Jean coming in at 20%, and then Travis Taves lagging a little bit at 15%, and the others, barely sort of ranked in like the low single digits kind of thing. Now, I should point out that this poll was of people who sort of self-identified as UCP members, as opposed to actual party members potentially, and it also might say more about the amount of press coverage they're getting, the amount of attention they're getting, than it does about actual support. So a little bit hard to know exactly what that poll is telling us, I think, but conventional wisdom certainly suggests that Travis Taves, Brian Jean, and Daniel Smith are in the sort of front of the pack here. So it's good to have a few numbers, I guess, that support that assumption or analysis, I guess.
So Tyler, when it comes to the top of their platform for the top 3, when we're talking about Daniel Smith, Travis Taves, and Brian Jean, what is it really that they're focusing in on right now? Like, obviously, we talked a little bit about Daniel Smith with the Alberta Sovereignty Act, Travis Taves, the former finance minister, is all about keeping the books balanced. But what about with Brian Jean specifically?
Well, Brian Jean has gone really hard on some cost of living stuff lately. Primarily gas prices would be the thing that I think he's got the most attention for in the last little while. And you're totally right on the other 2. Travis Taves has really been sort of a steady as she goes kind of guy. When we talked about the Alberta Sovereignty Act a moment ago, one of the things that he said about that is that a big issue for him is investor confidence and concerns about stability in the province. And so his criticism of the Alberta Sovereignty Act is actually that he thinks it will create less stability and make this a less attractive place for people to invest. So, for him, it's sort of, it's the economy stupid. And Danielle Smith is, of course, doing the sovereignty thing and talking about vaccinations and lockdowns and things like that. And Brian Jean also has sort of a sovereignty sort of platform, not sovereignty, that's not quite the right word, but more power to Alberta sort of platform that he's talked about as well. But for him, I think the biggest splash he's made has got to be on gas prices.
Yeah, speaking of which, Premier Kenney called on the Competition Bureau of Canada to probe gas prices, and they're finally beginning to come down.
They are, thankfully. Of course, people will remember when they dropped the fuel tax, would have been a couple months ago now, a month and a half ago maybe, that brought prices down or kept prices down by about 13 cents. And sort of over the course of the summer, that gap has sort of narrowed. And there's a potential handful of reasons why that's been the case, but is obviously causing some consternation. And Premier Kenney saying that, he wants to get to the bottom of this and find out whether or not there's price gouging going on at the pumps, which is also what Brian Jean has been saying, that he would, if he was Premier, he would use sort of regulatory powers to ensure that there was no price gouging at the pumps. But as you say, long weekend is coming up and prices have been trending downwards for the last couple of days. So if people are getting out of town, they might have some luck filling up the tank.
Yeah, what's interesting is around Lethbridge here in southwestern Alberta, a lot of the prices were $1.80, $1.85 a litre, and until Kenney called the Competition Bureau of Canada, then all of a sudden some, especially in Claresholm, it dropped down to $1.60, $1.45. I just filled up at UFA recently for $1.40, so yeah, it's nice to see that they're finally coming down, making life a little more affordable for us Albertans. Tyler, a big story we've been covering here on Bridge City News was how the Alberta Court of Appeal set aside some of the charges against Pastor Arthur Palowski, the street preacher in Calgary, his brother David, and Chris Scott, the owner of the Whistle Stop Cafe. It appears as though the court may have overstepped itself in sanctioning the 3.
Yeah, it's a bit of a legally complicated story, as I understand it. But the gist is, yes, that they sort of went too far beyond what the Crown and the defense were sort of arguing about when it came to convicting them. And it was so we went up to the Court of Appeal, and a three-judge panel, I guess, basically threw out these particular convictions, and they had primarily to do with contempt of court for sort of continuing to defy court orders. So, the relevant thing here, I think, for sort of political purposes, is just that this story isn't done yet. The story of the pandemic, that the story of pandemic enforcement, that the discussion about lockdowns and all those sorts of things, even though the policies themselves are in the past, there's still sort of the residual effects of this. And we're going to see, I think, as the UCP leadership race continues, when the House comes back in the fall, we're going to continue to see some of these debates ongoing.
Tyler, former NDP MLA and current independent member of the legislature, Thomas Dang, says he will not run again in next year's provincial election. Dang had been trying to rejoin the NDP after getting into trouble for hacking vaccine records to show the website with the vaccine passports on it was not exactly safe.
That's right. So court documents from a couple weeks ago basically show that he used sort of a brute force hack, or it's alleged that he used a brute force hack to try and get through that vaccine portal to see whether or not it was secure. So he's sort of argued that this was called a white knight hacking procedure, that, trying to expose vulnerabilities in the system as opposed to actually getting information. And he did find vulnerabilities and reported it to the NDP caucus, that then reported it to the health minister's office, I believe. And the RCMP came in and investigated him. So he was removed from the New Democratic caucus back in December or January, and has been sitting as an independent since then. He is facing a charge under I believe it's the Health Information Act. So it's not a criminal charge, but it does come with potential pretty hefty fines. But he'd been trying to rejoin the caucus and has sort of given up that fight and will not be running in next year's election. So just a little bit of a conclusion in some ways to part of his story at any rate.
It's interesting. Some political pundits look at Alberta almost like the United States, a two-party system. In the U.S., the Republicans, Democrats, Alberta, NDP, and of course the UCP. What's going on with the Liberal Party? What have we heard from them lately?
Oh, well, very little, absolutely nothing in many ways. They had been, I think, selecting a new leader recently, but that could have been the Alberta Party. Honestly, I should know. And even then, we haven't heard very much from the Wild Rose Independence Party since Paul Hinman ran in that by-election a couple months ago against Brian Jean, and he didn't win either. So they, maybe they're all on summer vacation and they'll come roaring back in the fall. I would expect that we'll start hearing from these smaller parties in the next few months, just because with an election coming up, there is always the chance of getting a seat or something like that. It hasn't always been, a two-party system.
That's true, yeah. Tyler, the province opened up fourth doses for COVID-19 vaccines. Some experts say now's the time to get it, while others argue maybe we should hold off. Can you explain why?
Well, it's because of the way that the variants of COVID are mutating, I guess, or evolving or adapting to get around vaccines. And so the question is whether or not the current vaccines are as effective against the current variants that we're dealing with. And so it might be better, some argue, to wait until there is a new vaccine that will more effectively combat these variants. But that's some months away, it seems to be the case, November, December potentially, and then a regulatory process. So, other experts saying that, look, this is a long ways off, especially if you're a vulnerable person, have an autoimmune condition or breathing problems or something like that, perhaps go get your fourth dose. But it does sort of come, I believe the sort of national vaccine body finally made its recommendation to open up doses to everyone over the age of 18. And so sort of all the provinces, I think, have moved to offer these doses in the last week or two.
Tyler, you're working at the legislature. Obviously, you rub shoulders with a lot of MLAs from all of the different parties. Is there any talk of Rachel Notley potentially stepping down if she loses next year's provincial election, and maybe having somebody like Shanna Phillips, should she secure her seat here in Lethbridge, to become party leader?
I haven't heard anything about that. I think the New Democrats are feeling pretty confident about their chances at the moment, even with Jason Kenney out of the picture, which causes them some electoral problems, I think. But no, I haven't heard very much about that. I mean, it's not hard to imagine that she would do it, but of course the question is, who is the obvious successor? Is it Darren Billis? Is it Shannon Phillips? Is it someone else? And so, it's hard to say, because even if they lose the next election, I would expect them to have a pretty substantial number of seats. They've been a very, very effective opposition party over the last few years. And they've also seen what the UCP is doing, which has gone through this sort of constant leadership chaos and what that means. So, I think there's probably arguments to either side, but I can't say I have any rumors or even useful information on that one.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks a lot for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.
The Pope's recent visit to Alberta was greeted with mixed emotions as Catholic Church leaders met with Canadian Aboriginal members in Edmonton this week. Much work has been done on truth and reconciliation for the atrocities of Canadian residential schools and the legacy of pain and trauma many say the school experience left behind in the families and homes of the Canadian First Nations. Well, joining me today to discuss the Pope's visit to Canada is Professor Crystal Gayle Fraser from the University of Alberta. We're so happy to have her with us. Ms. Fraser, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for the interest.
Okay, so now you are part of the governing circle guiding the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. That's huge. So I would like to know, what's your impression of the Pope's visit?
Yeah, there are many impressions. I think that this visit really had multiple audiences, and for me, you obviously mentioned my professional credentials, but I'm also an intergenerational residential school survivor. My grandmother and mother were institutionalized at Catholic Indian residential schools, and this apology has really been a long time coming. We were looking for something that was more thorough and more sincere than the April 1st remarks given at Vatican City. And I think that for a lot of people, the gesture of the Pope traveling to Canada, of that ceremony at Musqueam on Monday, of this Mass and all of the various activities, I really think that will help facilitate the healing process for many survivors. For other people, and perhaps myself included, I feel like the apology comes, a day late and a dollar short. That in order to really advance the pursuit of truth, which, for the record, we still don't know all there is to know about the history of residential schools, about the circumstances in which these children died and then were buried in unmarked graves. So there's a truth bit, but also the reconciliation, and reconciliation really needs action. And so we had very high hopes for this apology, but then also the expectation of accountability and an action plan that would be shared by the Catholic Church.
Okay, so you think that reconciliation could actually be achieved from this visit then? Do you think it's enough just to have that apology, or is there a solution to actually bring healing?
Yeah, I unfortunately do not think that one visit by the Pope, solves our problem of reconciliation. I think that we have a lot of other much deeper work to do, which really would tackle, systemic racism in Canada. It would give Indigenous nations their sovereignty back. We would have something else in place other than the Oppressive Indian Act. And so there's many things that need addressing. I think potentially what the Pope's visit can do is further this conversation about our knowledge of residential schools, about how the Catholic Church is willing to proceed. And I mean, to be fair, in his apology, he did say that the church is committed to supporting survivors, but also in launching an investigation, which is very curious. I'm looking forward to more information about that, especially considering we had our own $60 million investigation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, but then also other actions, which I think would bring, a lot of good to Indigenous peoples and push this envelope on reconciliation. So I've mentioned accountability. The Catholic Church needs to share the details of its former employees and clergy who worked at Indian residential schools, considering the last one closed in 1996. That's not that long ago. The church owns land in Canada and continues to profit from that. Is that going to be returned to Indigenous nations? And then also this question of the doctrine of discovery. So a lot really to talk about, and unfortunately just a very small piece of that was addressed in Maskwacis.
And speaking of that, I'm actually just curious, do you know why Edmonton and the Maskwacis Reserve was chosen as one of his first and only stops in Canada? Like, why not Kamloops, for example?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I can only speculate. I don't have the answers. But from my thinking as a historian, is that Edmonton is a very significant place for really for thousands of years. It has been a meeting place among First Nations, for trade, for relationships, and so there definitely is that historic piece here in Edmonton. And additionally, Edmonton is widely accessible, especially to Northerners and those living in territories that were highly affected by colonialism, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. But in particular, the former site of the Ermineskin Indian Residential School in Maskwacis, this was a pretty typical residential school in the sense that it was large, it housed a lot of children, it operated for a very long time, and it also had, one of the highest rates of disease and illness and death. So that institution was under scrutiny in the 1920s and 1930s for tuberculosis. But when we look at Maskwacis, they've also done a ton of work. The Cree Nations there have come together and have a united education council now. So also really an example of hope and of brilliance around Indigenous education.
Now, your work actually focuses on the residential schools histories and the effects of the residential school system in Canada. So can you talk maybe about the work of the Governing Circle and the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation?
Yes, I can. And so the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation was created out of the TRC. And what it is really meant to do is to provide a space for archives, for materials related to residential schools, all of the testimony that was given by Indian residential school survivors, which, there were about 6,000 to 7,000 testimonies that were collected across the country. All of that is stored there. And the NCTR is really meant to be a place where everyday people, you don't have to be academics, you don't have to be researchers. It can be families, it can be survivors, it can be, settler Canadians who are genuinely interested in these histories. They have a very vast collection online. And like you say, I'm a member of the Governing Circle, but we also have a Survivors Circle, which really is supposed to help make sure that we keep, our focus very narrow on the history of residential schooling in Canada and of histories of childhood and Indigenous families.
And Crystal, I'm sure you've heard all kinds of stories, even from your own family, like personal accounts that I'm sure are just really heartbreaking as well.
Yeah, well, absolutely. A lot of my work focuses on Indigenous storytelling, on experiences from survivors, but I actually don't think I'm, in a way, it is quite typical how I came to this work is that I actually knew nothing about it. That I had questions about my own family, I had questions about my community, and I was looking for the answers. And during this time, this would have been the 1980s and the 1990s. Many residential schools were still operating, and it wasn't something that was widely talked about in community. There was still a lot of pain and trauma, and even though a lot of individuals had already started the healing process, that hadn't really happened yet on a collective, in a collective way. And these weren't a part of national conversations. And so when I came to this work, when I started at the University of Alberta, that was actually the first time I had heard of residential schools, and so learning about it in university, and then going back to my community and starting these conversations with my grandmother, my mother, and extended family, and that was an extremely hard process. And that was also a very time ago, so 20 years ago, it wasn't widely talked about. And fortunately or unfortunately, whichever way you look at it, especially in the context of the now thousands of unmarked graves, this is something that is a part of Canada's national historical narrative.
Unfortunately, yes. Now, Crystal, last year about this time, we had a couple of interview guests on to talk about their experiences in the residential school system. And one had talked a little bit about medical experiments that took place in Edmonton. So has your research ever uncovered evidence of children being used for medical experiments like that?
Not my direct research in the sense of formalized experiments. However, we do know a lot of information about the Charles Capsule Indian Hospital in Edmonton. There's also the work of historian Ian Mosby. His work has looked at nutritional experiments on children. But when we look at the way that the bodies of Indigenous children were treated at residential schools, I mean, for sure, there are things like forced monthly pelvic examinations for girls and young women in order to monitor pregnancy, and these would have been at Roman Catholic institutions, right? So all kinds of ways in which students' bodies and health really was not under their own control.
Have you ever found any residential schools where it was actually a good experience for the children?
There are definitely people out there, survivors, who will say, that they did not have a bad experience. Looking back upon it, they got their education. They made, a lifelong network of friends. They were able to travel a little bit with residential schooling. So for sure, there are survivors out there who highlight those experiences, and I think it's important that we listen to the whole gamut of experiences that happened there. But I think in the bigger context, these are children who were responding to everyday conditions. Their attendance at residential schools was forced under the Indian Act. It was mandatory that they be institutionalized in most cases. And so although, children found ways to make their life happy, maybe they found a sport that they liked, really this whole system was designed to quote unquote kill the Indian in the child. And we now know it was highly oppressive and also genocidal.
Wow. And what effect did these schools have on the families that were left at home?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. This is actually a very understudied topic in the sense that you don't really read about it in history books, but through my interviews and through just casual conversations with family members and survivors, when that boat or train or aircraft came in late August or early September and took the children away, sometimes for 7 or 8 months, but also sometimes for years, particularly if you were Inuit and you lived in the Arctic. Those communities were very, very quiet. It was very, full of sorrow, and you had older generations of Indigenous parents and extended family, and also elders just mourning the lack of children in the community.
I can imagine. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one legacy too that the schools have left in families was that generational trauma. So can you maybe talk about how the effects of the harsh treatment and conditions are still being felt today, even generations later? And I mean, you're probably a perfect example of that, right?
Absolutely. The intergenerational trauma is very real. I mean, obviously important to note that we still have, thousands of survivors who are living today, and they were primarily affected by their time at residential schools. But for people like me and also my daughter, who, we don't know our language. And learning that process brings up a lot of emotions. We aren't connected to our land in a certain way that our ancestors were. Some of the traditional forms of storytelling have not been taught in a very long time. And so it's this constant struggle, but also a pleasure, to really try and get back to the very basic lessons and teaching of culture that we should have basically had since birth.
Dr. Fraser, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions.
Absolutely. Professor Crystal Gail Fraser is from the University of Alberta, and she is part of the governing circle guiding the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. Such a pleasure to have her on today. My name's Jeanette Roche. On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, thanks for watching.